The Echo Chamber, brought to you by The Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers. Sponsored by the Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. This is Arun Sudhaman from The Holmes Report. I'm here in New York, and I'm really happy to be joined by Claudine Moore. Claudine, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
I wonder if we could start. We're going to talk a little bit about public relations in Africa and about industry diversity, but maybe we could start if you can give us a really quick summary of what you do.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the Echo Chamber. I listen to this podcast a lot, so to be invited as a guest is an honour, and I appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. So my background really has sort of steeped in the big agencies. I used to work with Gray. I used to work with McCann Erickson, and one of my last corporate roles before I branched out on my own with Seymour Media was I was the US regional director for Hill & Knowlton, US.
Yeah.
And so sort of about 10 years ago, I sort of branched out on my own, launched Seymour Media, International Public Relations, where we focused on sort of the triangle, if you like, of the UK, US and African markets. At any given time, we have more US business than African and more African business than US, but those are the markets that we play in. And we have been doing that for the last 10 years, as well as consulting with different brands. Sometimes I get brought in by different organizations to consult with them on various things. So whether it's consulting with Louis Vuitton on their internal communication strategy across the US, or doing some internal comms for Johnson & Johnson, just different initiatives that I'll be called in to do. So I work with bigger brands still outside of Seymour Media. Okay,
cool. And you do quite a reasonable amount of work is cross-border in nature, or it involves other countries?
Yes, absolutely,
right?
yeah. And that's always been, it's been interesting because that's sort of what I sort of fell into. I think when I was working in the big agencies, they were like, okay, she's a Brit, but she's in New York. So whenever there was any international business, straight away, I was sort of like put front and center to do it or to work on it, which was great. And so I always enjoyed working across border, if you like, because my perspective is very much cross border.
Yeah, sure.
Being from the UK with Caribbean parents, and now living in the US, so it's like a Caribbean Brit American. So perspective is very sort of global.
Yeah, and you do a reasonable amount of work in Africa.
Yes,
which makes you something of a rarity, I think, in the industry in general, but in particular in the industry here.
Yeah.
Why is that the case? It still seems to me like there's not that much interest in Africa from a PR perspective.
Yeah, which is quite extraordinary to me, because there is so much opportunity, and that opportunity will continue to grow. I came armed with some statistics for you.
Okay, good.
So just to talk about the opportunity. So half of the global population between now and 2050 will be in Africa.
Yeah.
Over half.
Yeah.
The youth in African markets currently is 19% of global youth population, which is 226 million. And by 2030, which is only 10 years from now, the number of youths across Africa, youths being defined between 14 and 25, is going to increase by 42%.
Wow.
That's a huge opportunity, as well as a threat, but there's a huge opportunity there for brands. And consumer expenditure has risen, or is going to rise, to 2.5 trillion by 2030. And that's double the levels of what it was in 2015.
Wow, okay.
So where there's that sort of population growth and where there's that sort of increase in consumer expenditure, brands will go because they've got markets are suddenly wide open. And then that's not even talking about internet penetration, which is still very, very low across Africa. So as internet penetration becomes, gets more and more sort of widespread across the continent, there's more opportunity there. So a lot of brands are realizing that, and more are realizing that. I think the agencies themselves are still sort of behind when it comes to what that means for their sort of expansive work with some of their own clients.
Yeah.
And that's for multinational brands and organizations, as well as indigenous organizations on the continent too, which is still very big. I mean, Africa's a big place. It's 54 countries, not one country.
Yeah, and it does it such a disservice to even talk about it as Africa. When there are there's such diversity of economies across the region. It seems to me that many networks, when I talk to them, just find it challenging to build their business in African markets. And typically they focused on, let's say, South Africa, Kenya, and maybe Nigeria.
Yeah.
And a few other places as well. But they just, it just seems to be that it's almost too much. They seem to think it's more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah, which again, when you look at some of the stats that I just now provided for you, and you look at some of what some organizations and brands are doing across the continent, it's astonishing to me that they would think that. I think part of the reason is that, Africa as a continent itself, just looking at the continent as a whole, has a branding issue. And I think that's where it sort of starts from. It has a branding issue. Bad news is loud, good news is a whisper. Yeah. So there's a lot of quote unquote bad news stories out of Africa that will get a lot of news. You'll hear about the famines. Yeah. You'll hear about the diseases. Yeah. You'll hear about war and security issues. But then you don't hear about the fact that brands like Gap and H&M have a lot of factories in Ethiopia, and that's growing. You don't hear about the burgeoning technology space across Kenya and sure. And in Nigeria. You don't hear about those kinds of stories. And as somebody who works with organizations that have some of these good business stories, it's a real uphill battle sometimes to get even the media interested. But I know if I went to the media with a story about Ebola's broken out in this country, I mean, they'd be all over it. So I think to a certain extent, when people are thinking about Africa, before they even begin to think about it from a PR perspective, they already have a very sort of deep-seated preconceived notions about what Africa is and what Africa means. And then once you get past that, the next layer is, well, what does that mean for our business? But you've got to get over that first hurdle. What does it mean for our business? And there are opportunities. There are some agencies, I will say, who are doing, making an effort to sort of expand their network.
For sure.
From South Africa, and we can talk about some of the agencies that are making an effort and growing. But they're few and far between.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. I mean, it seemed to me about 10 years ago suddenly they kind of all woke up to Africa and they needed to be there. And then a lot of them went into South Africa.
Yes.
And then that's it. I mean, that
exactly.
seems to have been the extent of it.
And that's it.
And South Africa is, obviously, it's a unique country within Africa itself.
Absolutely.
So...
Absolutely. I mean, South Africa is not Africa.
Ooh,
I mean, it's funny.
You wouldn't tell a South African that.
Exactly, you wouldn't. But when I say that, let me just quantify what I mean. I remember the first country that I went to in Africa was South Africa, and I came back and I was excited to this was in 2009. I was excited to have finally visited Africa, and I had friends of mine saying, "Oh, you haven't been to Africa. You've been to Africa Light. You need to go to full fat Africa. That's sub-Sahara Africa." And South Africa obviously is Africa the same way Great Britain is part of Europe, but Great Britain doesn't like to consider itself part of Europe. It will consider itself as being Great Britain.
Well, that's another story.
So it's that sort of notion of being different but being part of at the same time. But South Africa is very different to Sub-Saharan Africa, as is North Africa different to Sub-Saharan Africa.
Absolutely.
So I remember there being, articles several years ago, and I'm sure you did articles as well.
Yes, I think I wrote many of them.
Yeah, exactly, about the opportunities and about the PR industry in Southern Africa. And I think some of the big agencies have made some sort of effort into having strategic partnerships with agencies in Kenya, agencies in Ghana, agencies in Nigeria and Rwanda. Nigeria, Nigeria. And some of them are working well, some of them aren't working so well. And I think the key is to find the right partner, as with everything. And the key is to really, when you're expanding and your HQ is in New York City, you have to really understand that how you execute comms in the US and in the Europe is very different to how you execute comms in some of these African markets, and each African market is different within itself.
Yeah.
So there's a certain amount of sort of both expansive thinking and accepting of how things are done, and that for some agencies is a complete sort of like, wow, we've got to, change the way we work just for these markets. I mean, for some of them, that's just too much to even start thinking about.
Yeah. Is most of your work there? Is it for international companies in Africa, or is it for indigenous players?
It's a bit of both, really.
Yeah.
So I've worked with indigenous organisations. I've worked with indigenous Pan-African investment companies who are doing a lot of investments across Africa in different sectors. So, I mean, that was a great experience. But then we also work with some startups who are US-based, who are doing work across the continent. So, for example, one of the clients that we're working with now is a tech startup called WorldCover, who just secured $6 million in Series A funding. And they basically leverage technology to provide climate insurance for small-scale farmers across the continent, which is a first. It's a global first. And they work in Ghana, Uganda and Kenyan markets, and their series, their recent funding round is helping them expand across the US. So we work with US organizations that are like that are based here, but they're doing work in Africa, in the tech space and startup space. And we've been doing that, really sort of getting more business actually in the tech space from US companies. So it's not even the big US companies, it's some of the smaller ones.
Yeah, I would imagine there's quite a lot of demand. Actually,
it's actually growing a lot. I started working sort of in African markets, like I said, 10 years ago, and it was very slow in the beginning, and it certainly has sped up. I mean, like with any business, you have peaks and troughs, but it certainly has sped up in the last several years, and I would say increasingly in the last 2 years. So that's really exciting. What's interesting, though, and it could just be because of the size of our consultancy, Seymour Media, but what's interesting, though, is the number of startups that are US-based and UK-based, because I have a partner agency that is part of the wider Seymour Media family, and they work in the tech startup space from out of London. And they say the same thing. The startup space when it comes to tech is really blowing up across the continent. And they're small companies. And so I think they like working with another small agency. Just a bit nimble. Our retainer fees are not quite as high. And we sort of understand that entrepreneurial journey as well. So it's an exciting time, but it's not without challenges because it's very different doing comms there.
Do you work with local PR firms at all in Africa? Do you?
Well, we have our teams. We have a team. We have consultants who work with us in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Kenya. When it's a bigger project, we will partner with agencies. And one of the things that I really made a point of doing when I first started going to mainly West Africa, mainly Nigeria, is where I've spent the lion's share of my time. I'm really getting to know the local PR industry through the Nigerian Institute of Public Relations. And I mean, they're a great bunch of folks over there.
Yeah, we deal with them a lot, actually.
I mean, and they are really dedicated to the industry. And so I'm thinking particularly of Yomi. I'm sure Yomi, who you know.
Yeah, needs no introduction.
Exactly. Shout out to Yomi if he's listening. But Yomi, who ever since I went to Nigeria 10 years ago, he's been nothing but welcoming, and he's like the face of PR in Nigeria. And he works with APRA, who I know that you partner with.
Yeah, we have I think it's next week, in fact, in Kigali, Sabre Awards Africa, and
that's right.
into Summit Africa with APRA.
And I think even the fact that, you guys are like now doing more in Africa. I mean, when did you start doing that? Was that 2 years ago?
Well, we did our first event in Africa, in South Africa, which was a round table, actually 5 years ago.
Okay.
And then we launched the conference properly in South Africa 4 years ago, and we did it 3 times, so 3 years in South Africa, and now we've moved it to Rwanda, to Kigali, which I'm very happy about. South Africa was great, but I think, almost like what you said, it's easier in South Africa, and I mean, there's just a lot of firms and a lot of people who aren't going to engage, I don't think, as much with an event in South Africa,
and never will.
Yeah, but they will with one in Kigali in Rwanda.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's, even in the last few years, the Kigali becoming a conference destination. That's something new that's happened.
Yeah. There's another conference later this year, I think.
There is.
Yeah.
That's what I was looking at. The Global African Forum on Communications.
Yeah.
So the Global Africa Forum on Communications, which I'm actually speaking at that conference.
Yeah.
And so are a lot of other brands are involved in that. Coca-Cola, they have somebody speaking. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Minister of Information for Ghana is speaking. It's just interesting because Rwanda's done so much in the last several years, to sort of turn their country around, as well as sort of shift the global perception of Rwanda. When people think of Rwanda, they tend to think of the genocide.
Yeah.
And that happened 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So over 25 years ago. 25 years ago, exactly. So, 25 years ago. So they've done a lot to move on from that while still recognizing that, which is important. But the fact that they are now like the conference, leading conference destination.
Because when people talk about Ireland,
it never used to be.
They don't kind of... it's not like it's about the troubles, and that's the number one thing. Ireland's now a huge business destination, right?
Yeah.
It's a totally different narrative.
Totally different. And, I think they still have a long way in terms of, I haven't been to Rwanda. This will be my first time going in August. Okay. But everyone tells me that, yes, the conference, space is great, but there still isn't much to do in terms of sort of like...
Oh, in Kigali.
Yeah, in Kigali, in terms of like socializing.
Go up to the mountains maybe.
Right, exactly. Which is in stark contrast to somewhere like Kenya or somewhere like Nigeria. But... doing a conference in Nigeria logistically can be very, very difficult because of the power issues.
Yeah.
The cost of internet access for a conference center or a conference venue is huge.
And these are the things I think people don't always know, right? There's maybe this assumption that you can just pitch up and plug in and...
Yeah, I wish it was. I wish it was that easy. I mean, you can pitch up and plug in, but when you plug in, you might not get any power.
Yeah,
so
right.
You have all these things to think about. I've sat on the board of Social Media Week Lagos for the last 7 years, and we've done conferences at different venues across Nigeria, across Lagos, really, and one of the biggest expenses. I mean, just a huge expense is getting the power, because you can't rely on just the power for the venue. You have to get your generators and get your generators, and then you need to make sure that you have internet access and at your venue, and that gives a huge expense. So these are things that you really have to think about, that you can take for granted, which is why it's so important, I think, when you are coming from outside of the continent and you want to do something in the continent, work with local partners. I think sometimes there's a notion that, you can sort of go in there and you can just, like you said, pitch up and do it yourself. But there's so much sort of intel and knowledge that you need to know from each of those individual markets. That's so important, just from knowing who to partner with to some basic logistics.
Yeah.
So it's just important to take that into consideration.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about diversity in the industry. It's a hot topic, a lot of talk. Now, you're British, as our listeners may have gathered already, from your home county's accent.
Exactly.
But you're of Caribbean descent?
That's right. My mother is Jamaican and my father's from Barbados.
Oh, okay.
But I was born and raised in England, yeah.
Okay. Now you're in New York.
Yeah.
And the industry here, I think it's fair to say, agencies in particular, still not particularly diverse. You worked at the big agencies when they were probably even less diverse.
Yeah, I mean, they were less diverse, but this is actually like a topic of frustration for me, because
I can imagine.
Because I feel, I moved to America and I moved to New York in particular in the early 2000s. And I began working in the agency world when I first moved here. So we're talking, coming up for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
There's no change.
Right.
I'm talking 20 years. There's no change. I've had, my roles that I've had at the agencies, I was always working with the C-suite within the agencies. Not myself as a C-suite executive, sorry, not myself, but because of the roles that I had within the agencies, I was always working with the CEOs and so on.
Yeah.
And always one of a few women in the room, but women has increased slightly.
Yeah.
Always the only person of color in the room. And even when I go to bigger agencies now, and when I do get brought in to work to consult with some of these bigger agencies now, the diversity, lack of diversity is just startling.
Yeah.
And it's a source of frustration to me because there are certain, and I won't name names, but there are certain agencies that will sponsor some of these diversity events. But I know that it's literally just to cross off a line on a spreadsheet because they will talk about sort of supporting diversity, but then you look at these organizations and there's no diversity whatsoever. I've had my own experiences where, just because I've worked in a big agency background, and because whilst I'm an independent consultant, I stay very much in the loop in terms of keeping relevant and keeping up to date in the industry. So I often get approached by these bigger agencies to potentially, pack up shop and work with them. And there's one particular agency that I will not name, but I'm so tempted to. And I think I had nearly 15 interviews. The CEO signed off on me wanting to give me this big role, and I remember having a meeting with the manager, the GM of their New York office, and as soon as he saw me, I just knew that as soon as he saw me, I knew that he didn't want to. It's one of those things. I knew that at that point, this probably wasn't going to happen, even though I'd already negotiated salary and sort of and it was a global role. It was incorporating some work in Africa that had all been signed off on, and I then saw, they then had the excuse of, oh well, we decided not to fill that role. We decided not to have that role. Only see that role a few months later. You see the announcement go out, and there's a white male who's got the role. And it's frustrating because a lot of agencies will talk about diversity, but there's no real commitment behind it. It really is just words, and that has not changed in 20 years.
Do you think that it can only change if clients make it change?
I think so. It was just a few years ago, wasn't it, when the CMO from HP, was it?
Antonio Lucio.
Yes, right. And I mean,
2 or 3 years ago.
2 or 3 years ago, he sort of put his sort of stake in the ground and said, if the agencies don't diversify in terms of gender and race, and sort of diversify in terms of sort of, diversifying your sort of workforce it is having more women. It is having in leadership positions. It is having more people of color. And people of color, there's a spectrum of people of color. That's African American, it's Latinx, it's Pacific Islanders, and then age as well, which is really important. And I think it's going to take a long time. I think it's really going to be pushed by dollars. I think when you're forced to do it, you'll do it, and if you're not forced to do it, you won't.
Yeah.
I think one of the people that I respect deeply in the industry is Kim Hunter. Kim Hunter's a dear friend, and he is very, very dedicated to diversity in the industry through his LeGrant Foundation. And he even says that it's they claim to be about diversity, but when it really comes down to it, we don't know where to look.
But it's the access issue as well, isn't it? Because I feel like at the lower levels of the industry, they're relying on people who are affluent.
Yes,
aren't they? Really?
Yeah.
To come in and not need that much salary, and to also maybe already be living somewhere rent free, in New York,
or heavily subsidized in some way,
in New York, and then of course you will end up with a certain type of person. I think, and it's almost like the whole model needs to change.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a brilliant point, because it is. I mean, at the lower levels of the industry, you know, the salaries are not very high. New York's a very expensive place.
Yeah.
The bigger agencies are certainly here. I think some of the smaller agencies probably do a bit better when it comes to diversity, but the bigger ones certainly have a lot of room for improvement. You know, it is an access issue, and that I think that's something to sort of think about, not just for the PR industry, but for many industries.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think that's unique to the PR industry. You know, one thing I will say is that I think the way that I got into the PR agency through the bigger agencies was because my first job here was with McCann Erickson doing PR and communications for the actual agency itself.
Yeah.
And so straight away I was with a big agency.
Yeah.
And then once you're in, it's a little easier to go from sister agency to sister agency. But to even get in is extraordinarily, the barriers to entry are there. And
Yeah.
you're up against people who have got, you know, families and friends with big networks.
Yeah, I know.
Who will, you know, push your resume to the top of the pile.
Yeah.
And
I'm amazed at
yeah.
how many kids
right.
are in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, what can one say about that? Because if you're fortunate enough to be, you know, a child of person X, or, you know, neighbor of person X, I mean, who wouldn't take advantage of that?
Yeah,
I would,
right.
you would, you know.
I wish I could have. Yeah.
You know, that, I mean, we would if some, you know, that's what networking's about, if we're honest. But it's just unfortunate that sort of is so skewed towards sort of certain groups.
Yeah, and the other point I always kind of think is really important to discuss is, because we know about the recruitment issues, but the retention issues, really important, in particular the cultural context that exists in agencies just doesn't seem to be set up to welcome and accommodate people from different cultural backgrounds. And it's still very homogenous around just little things like what music is on, and what are the conversations about, and what are the shared, not necessarily values, but what are the shared things that people are doing. Because the agencies live on their kind of, you know, what are we doing on Monday evening or Tuesday evening, Wednesday
Right, yeah. But Taco Tuesdays.
Exactly, right. But it's very homogenous, right?
Yeah, you know what, to be honest with you, Aaron, I find this particular issue quite hard to speak on, because culturally my background isn't American.
Yeah, right.
So culturally speaking, I'm sort of coming in very differently to somebody who would be, fair enough, I'm a black British woman.
Yeah.
But culturally speaking, that's very different to being a black American woman.
Yeah, sure.
So I find that this quite difficult, I think, to sort of maybe fully relate to, because culturally I'm coming as a British person, not as an African American person.
Right. Yeah.
So some of the sensibilities that may be there don't exist for me personally. And also, but interestingly, some of the interactions that I may get from other people would may be different from if I was an African American person.
Sure.
So, you know, but so I do find this quite difficult sometimes to really fully embrace, because it doesn't just, the interaction with me from other people is not just rested on race, but it's rested on nationality as well. And, you know, Americans like Brits. Americans like Brits.
I think the accent helps.
I think the accent maybe helps. And so I know, I mean, I remember once, and I'll be very transparent in this, I remember once with one of the big agencies I worked at, and the HR person was African American. And I've never actually mentioned this story before, so it'll be interesting to see any reactions to this. But I remember coming into the office one day, and she was the HR person, and we were talking, and she said, you know, the atmosphere here is so hostile. And she said, I feel like I'm coming into war every day I'm in the office as a black woman coming in here. And she said, don't you feel the same? And I didn't.
Okay.
I didn't feel like I was walking into a war zone. Yeah. But she did. Now, is that, you know, what's the reason for that? I don't know. It could be is it because we have different cultural sort of experiences, myself and this woman, and we're looking at things through different prisms? Possibly. Could it be a personality thing? Possibly. It could be, a plethora of different reasons. But I found that really interesting because she said she feels like she's coming into a war zone every day she comes to the office. And I didn't feel like that at that agency.
Yeah.
And she was astonished that I didn't feel like that. And I was astonished that she felt like that.
Yeah.
So in answering sort of that question, I find it a little bit difficult because I think my sort of background as a British person just gives me a slightly different prism in terms of, how I maybe interact with other people and how other people maybe interact with me.
Yeah, no question. I mean, and personally, I see it obviously differently as well, given my own background. But we wrote a story about this. We did some research a couple of years ago, and this came out as the big kind of signal finding from, I think in particular African Americans, but also Latin community as well, that just they felt they weren't being accommodated culturally. And I think that's it was almost like it's something that hadn't even occurred to agencies.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important there's some easy sort of activations that agencies can do around sort of, national initiatives. So it fits Black History Month. I mean, that's something easy for an agency to sort of, okay, it's everywhere, it's February, it's Black History Month, let's do something. I mean, that's something easy for an agency and a company to do. Or it's Pride Month, MLK Day, Martin Luther King's birthday. That's a national holiday, and that's a great opportunity. I mean, the literally everybody has that day off. That's a huge opportunity to do something in the office around equality, and equality is now way more expansive to include other groups. So, I mean, there are some real basic things that agencies can do that are basic in terms of you don't have to think about it. It's visible. It's Black History Month, for example, and so on. But sometimes it's just they just don't see the need to do it. Yeah. And sometimes it does take that one person of color in the office to be the one to suggest it. If you're looking at things from your own individual perspective as a Caucasian person or as an Indian person or as a Black person, you can't necessarily always expect people to look at things from everybody else's perspective. But then there are certain roles within companies that's their job. Yeah. Their job is specifically to make sure things are inclusive. Yeah. And so those people have a big responsibility to actually do their job and do it well, because they are trained, and that's their role to actually make sure that diversity and inclusion actually means diversity and inclusion. Yeah.
Claudine, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I feel like we could talk for quite a long time about this, and maybe we should next time.
Sure.
But it's a real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
For your first podcast.
My first ever podcast, and I'm delighted that it was with you.
Thank you, and definitely not your last. All right.
Thank you.
Take care, thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. This is Arun Sudhaman from the Holmes Report, and very happy to be joined in New York today by Brian Morrissey, who is, I think, president and editor-in-chief of DigiDay.
That's right, Aaron.
Correct. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for coming by our office.
Yeah, no, it's great. We're in the DigiDay offices, which are in fact the Business Insider.
They're
offices.
not the Business Insider office.
I didn't know
Business
this.
Insider building, and
okay.
not their entire building, but yeah, they have 2 floors. We have half of one of those floors.
Do you ever write kind of a story about Business Insider and then they come around looking for you?
No.
It's never happened.
No.
Okay.
No.
All right.
I see some of the commercial folks in the men's room.
Right. Okay.
So
it's useful.
And I asked Pete. I was like, "What's going on?
What's the next pivot?"
Exactly.
What is the next?
I always see them like playing. They have some sort of like shuffleboard thing out there, and I see their like salespeople like. Often, like it's like I'll be going to the restroom at like 4:30 or so, and they've got a beer open, they've got the shuffleboard out, so I'm like, it must be a good quarter.
Yeah, well, that's the digital media for you, I guess. It's just shuffleboard and beer.
Yeah,
but tell us a little bit about DigiDay, because it seems like your brand has grown quite successfully over the past 8 or 9 years.
Yeah. So we're about 10 years old. We started really as an events company, which is unusual because usually you see media companies go into events, and this was a little bit backwards. So Nick Fries founded us 10 years ago, started with an event, brought together a bunch of publishers who were trying to figure out all the changes that were happening to their businesses because of the influx of digital technology. And so I joined about 8 years ago, and the opportunity that both Nick and I saw were to take this events platform and to build content and really a brand on top of it. I think events are a great way to get to people together. The problem, and they monetize well. The problem is it's not a way, really, I don't think, to build a sustainable brand. You need to have content. You need to have influence. And the way you get influence, the best way you get it, is through day in and day out. So
editorial.
Yeah. So we spent, several years trying to build up, that editorial credibility. I think we did a fairly good job. And so we're taking that model and expanding it into new areas. We started a publication that was originally focused on fashion called Glossy, and now it's fashion and beauty and the wild world of wellness, which I'm happy to go deep into.
Wellness influencers.
Wellness influencers. Yeah. And we are soon expanding into the modernization of retail.
Oh, good. Because I thought you were going to say PR then, and I was a little concerned.
No.
No plans.
No plans.
That was
that's a really good idea.
Well, if
we might have to cut this short.
Yeah. Well, if you're looking for options in the PR space, just let us know.
Yeah.
So it's interesting you talked about the importance of building up that editorial credibility. I read elsewhere you don't like the phrase trade media because it implies cheerleading. And I'm guessing that, I know, Digiday doesn't cheerlead. How do you balance that kind of a stance with the fact that you are making money from these people?
Sort of. But I think I'll get to the model in a second, but I think what at least what I saw happening was there used to be this divide between consumer media and trade media. So there was the stuff you read because you're interested in it, and the stuff you read and consume because it's relating to your work. I think those differences have evaporated, and the expectations of people have changed completely. So they used to accept, we used to accept all sorts of things. We used to accept that, we had to go to the bank in order to withdraw money and stuff like this. There was all these things that I grew up with, which looking back are crazy, and I think that has sort of gone away. So the expectations of things that people consume for professional reasons are pretty much the same as the things that they consume for just because they're interested in things.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So I think that has, and I think trade media coasted for a long time on being boring and being cheerleaders and doing some pay for play because they could, because it was a protected industry, like a lot of industries. Adweek and Ad Age had 75 to 35-year head start on us, but only because they didn't have a lot of competitors because the barriers to entry were too great. They had the mailing lists, they had the print distribution, they had the access. But I think what happened and what we saw happening was there was tremendous amounts of business change going on in the publishing world, for advertisers and for agencies too, on the marketer side. And in those times of tremendous flux, that old model of doing some cheerleading, of doing the 50 under 50 lists and stuff like this, and then going and shaking down the people on the list clients to do congratulatory ads, that sort of goes away because you can do a little bit of that, I guess, but what people really need is the need for real critical information goes up. In static industries, I think you can do the old school trade model, but the problem is these days, because of technology, I don't know many industries that are static. So I think that's exciting, and I think that's why we're seeing a sort of rebirth of B2B in some way.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. diagnosis. Actually,
We have to disagree. What can we?
we'll find something. I'm sure. I'm sure. I hope. So let's talk a little bit about digital publishers, or let's say publishers on digital, perhaps.
Yeah.
And we saw the pivot to video. What happened there? What went wrong?
I mean, I think that there's a bunch of different diagnoses, but I think broadly we saw a lot of venture-funded publishers who got funding on a set of assumptions that didn't turn out. So the core assumption, because I've seen this chart, everyone rolled out the Mary Meeker chart, and that showed the amount of time spent on the internet, and then this gulf between the time spent and the amount of budget spent. And the idea was something needed to close that gap, and these publishers would close that gap. So a lot of digital publishers sprang up, and the idea was they were going to hoover up all that money. The problem was Google and Facebook hoovered up all that money because digital advertising just became a data game, and publishers can't win that. And so these publishers were stuck with these display ads that, because of programmatic advertising, were completely commoditized. Their audiences were commoditized. And they couldn't build enough scale in order to make the numbers work with the expectations that they had raised at. So video broadly was looked at as a lifeboat. And so the decisions for many publishers, not all, but many publishers, to pivot into video was made for venture capitalists and maybe a distant second for advertisers. And users were somewhere around like 9th or 10th. I don't know who does 2 to 9, but it wasn't users. People were not, clamoring for Mike to, like, if only you guys could, pump out some like first person video.
Yeah. And the money didn't follow?
No. I mean, I think the big challenge with video is that it takes a long time to figure out. It takes a lot of upfront costs. And but the core issue was this wasn't a core competency of a lot of these publishers. And I keep going back to it. This was not audience driven. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is the wreckage of people making decisions that were not really audience driven. And some of it is not totally their fault. Yeah, there was a lot of exogenous forces like around Google and Facebook and all that, and programmatic that you can sort of point the finger to. But, ultimately, publishers are responsible for navigating the environment they're in, and many fail to do that.
I'm so glad we didn't pivot to video. It's such a great example of this kind of herd mentality.
Yeah.
You see. So what's the next pivot? Because I find it hard to believe there won't be something.
We're already seeing it. It's the pivot to paid.
Oh, okay. Right.
Okay.
I
mean, because it's like you jump and it's like, well, man, display ads are not going to cut it.
Okay. So you've made the pivot to paid, have you not?
In a way, yes. I think ours is a little different. Of course, I'm going to say that. Just because, and that's where I see the sort of to loop it back to the B2B and why B2B is more relevant now than ever. At the core of a B2B model and our model is community, right? And it sounds cheesy and stuff, but it's really true. I mean, our company began with a group of 60 publishers getting together in a room. It was based off of community. And I think when it comes to events and events being part of our DNA, that really helps, not just on a monetization perspective, but because it brings you face to face with your audience, and you really start to build things build editorial around audience needs that you find out like in person. I mean, one of the great things about B2B and it always having events is that you come face to face with your audience like quite a bit.
Yeah.
And you don't have that in a lot of media. So I think that allows for a lane in order to have a balanced business model. I think a lot of what you're seeing in B2C with the pivot to paid is people are trying to balance, de-risk themselves from over-reliance on advertising. That is the number one goal. I think B2B has always been a much more balanced revenue model.
Mm-hmm.
It's never been a display ad-driven
No.
model.
No.
So I think that's the difference. And ideally, it's people's corporate credit cards.
It's easier.
OPM,
Yeah.
other people's money.
Yeah, absolutely. So you are skeptical, let's say, about the pivot to paid as it applies to broader media brands.
I mean, I think it's going to be challenging for the same brands that are challenged in any other pivot, and those are the ones that are in the middle, right? So the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, they're
Fine.
Yeah. W. Focus media brands, a Digiday, if you will, Stratechery, the information. Like, I mean, you go on, and particularly this is where B2B intersects. They are more likely to succeed, even like a Barstool Sports, right? Because they have a very defined audience that is very attached to it. They have a community, and I think that they'll be able to make this. You get into the ones in the middle, and it's a lot harder, because I think a lot of what they have become in their digital iterations, for those that were say magazine brands, is they become indistinguishable from each other. Like I keep going back to, and a lot of this is driven by the display ad model, because when you get on that treadmill, that scale treadmill, you have to keep doing it. You start to optimize to massive numbers, and guess what? That means doing a lot of the same shit everyone else is doing, because everyone has the same tools. Yeah, there's a reason Meghan Markle draws audiences. You are going to be the 10,000th person writing about the royal baby, because that is going to draw clicks. But then you can't turn around and be like, oh, we're totally differentiated and blah, blah. You can't have it both ways.
And you need to pay for this.
Yeah, because, people are not paying for the 10,000th article on the royal baby.
Does digital flatten media brands, do you think?
Yeah. I think what digital, what we've clearly seen across a lot of industries is the pull to commoditize, I would say. What Google and Facebook have done is commoditize brands. And that is, you put, and Amazon, and you put a brand into Google, or you speak it into Alexa, and algorithms take over.
Yeah, but it's interesting because with both of those, particularly with Facebook, publishers were complicit. They didn't need to turn their content into Facebook instant articles, or whatever, and that that's been another challenge that they faced, is giving up their content to these platforms. Is that something that they're able to salvage now?
I mean, yes, depends. I mean, I think the publishers that have a core differentiation and a real brand and a real community around that brand will absolutely find a way. A lot of these things are just challenges to navigate. But those that did not have those brands and real communities and audiences, because a lot of people had what they thought were audiences, but they were really Facebook's audience, right? I mean, come on, they weren't really their audience. Yeah. Like I see the numbers. What it was like, I just saw I was reading an article about how Brit & Co. is in danger and all this sort of things, and how they claim an audience of 110 million. I'm like, yo, come on. What are you counting? Every single person that's seen a pin on Pinterest? I mean, that's the kind of nonsense that, navigating your way out of that is really difficult, because you've optimized to it.
Yeah. Okay. So, digital fraud, and
all right, let's get into
it. Let's do it. So we've heard a lot from brands. Well, some brands in particular. Let's say Unilever, P&G, about how they are focused on tackling this, and how it's completely unacceptable, and they want
They're outraged.
metrics.
They're outraged.
Yeah, there is a lot of outrage out there.
We've mandated dollar video CPMs, and we're outraged some of these video ads are appearing on these Korean porn sites.
Yeah. Well, there's that as well.
How did this happen?
I mean, is it something that they can really tackle? Or has the horse bolted?
I don't know. I mean, like, do they have the wherewithal to do it? Like, I mean, ultimately, you get what you paid for. And I don't shed a lot of tears for Unilever or any of these big brands at night. Well, no, because
You're so
I think
heartless.
you can. Will anyone think of Unilever?
I mean, who will cry for Unilever, Brian?
Yes. When it came for Unilever, I said nothing. No, because a lot of the problems that exist in the overall digital media and advertising industry and the agency industry directly, it's not even a 6 degrees thing. It's probably like a 2 degrees thing, land at the doorstep of these big brands, making short-term decisions that overall have led to a pretty screwed up ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
So these brands have been focused on cutting costs in the name of efficiency for so long and squeezing the supply chain at every single step of the way, that when that supply chain then becomes unhealthy and abnormal, for them to turn around and say, my God, what is going on here? How did this happen? I mean, maybe it's time to sort of look in the mirror. I mean, rather than pontificate at conferences about this.
Gosh.
Because
it's kind of a revolutionary idea.
Because, look, nobody likes the idea that there is, except for those benefiting from it, that there's a ton of of fraud and bullshit in the digital media supply chain. But, unless people are going to pay more for quality, then you can't have it both ways. Yeah. I don't. So it's really hard for me to shed many tears the fact that Unilever is wasting a lot of money. Because I'm pretty sure it can be traced back to decisions that Unilever itself. I don't mean to call out Unilever specifically.
Well, no, it's very clear
brands.
that you've got a particular agenda when it comes to Unilever.
I've been wronged by one of their toilet paper products.
I can't imagine which brand it was, but I mean, I didn't know this. But
yes. Some sort of body wash went wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it was Axe. Maybe not. Okay, so you talked about digital fraud. We talked about digital fraud, and that kind of leads us nicely to influencers, I feel, because that just seems to be out of control. There's so much money being spent now on influencers. I think everyone seems to think at some point the bottom will fall out of the market. Yeah. It's not happening. Why not?
I think like a lot of things you probably see in marketing, I mean, it's still kind of like a shiny object of some sorts. Like, look, the digital media, digital media plans have become pretty, static. It's like, okay, you're going to dump all your money in like Google and Facebook and Instagram, and like, influencers are sort of the sexy part of it. But anytime like a lot of money goes towards something, you're going to have a lot of nonsense, a lot of grifters popping up. And the fact is, like anything in digital media, like I always say, like the performance indicators of any sort of new tactic in digital media, I remember being said to me, only go in one direction. That's down. Right. Like, you know, the display ads used to have a 60% click-through rate at some, for 1 month. Now it's like, what? So I think what you end up seeing is the commoditization of this, because, again, I just sort of go back to my ironclad theory of digital technology commoditizes everything. So it'll commoditize this kind of stuff because people will start to tune it out. And then it'll be on to the next thing.
Do you get any sense it's becoming more scientific?
No.
No.
Do you?
No, but I think you're probably closer to it than I am. I mean, it doesn't seem to me like brands or their agencies are really that clear on what they're buying or why they're buying it.
But I would look to the motivations. Like, I mean, usually there's a motivation when there's like opacity in the digital media marketplace. I usually think that there's a motivation on like one or oftentimes many sides to have that opacity. Like you look at programmatic advertising, all of the problems of programmatic, like I don't think it's not a fraud, it's a conspiracy, because like there's a bunch of different sides that benefit from that opacity, right?
Right. Yeah.
So like when ads show up somewhere they shouldn't be and everyone is able to point the finger at everyone else and stuff like this, that's not a bug, that's a feature. So I'm sure agencies see this. Look, this is my sense. I mean, they've had margin clawed away from them.
And now
they made hay a little bit with the programmatic and trading desk. They were able to do a little cheeky double dipping, but that got shut off. It sucks. And so, who knows? Influencers is probably another pot of money to.
Well, I think certainly
wet their beaks.
I mean, but they've just created these monsters.
These monsters. Now you're attacking Kylie.
Yeah. No names in particular. I mean, I wouldn't be able to tell you that many of them. But
they've become like a parody, right? I mean, that's the big challenge.
Yeah, but the money is still flowing freely.
But again, it's one of those things where it's like a yes, but I guess that's like everything is. There are a level of these quote-unquote influencers who have built tremendous connections with their communities and are able to do, and I hate the word activate, but they're able to do really interesting things because of that. I'm like using every buzzword. I hate that. Like authentic connection with their audiences. I know. It's horrible. And so, like what Emily Weiss was able to turn her blog into Glossier, like that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Leave aside all the Kardashians and stuff like this. There are some really interesting things going on. I think the problem is there's a lot of charlatans out there.
Well, it comes back to what you said, right? I think it's the same strategy even for influencers. It's if you have that editorial credibility and that community. I mean, it's kind of the same rules in a way.
Yeah. I mean, they're just different types of media entities, I guess, in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, they're media brands, I guess, of their own.
Yeah.
But they're just making much more money, I would imagine.
Well, it's a very lightweight model, right? It's like, if you're an Instagram,
low overhead.
If you're an Instagram influencer, you've got like a few Wranglers, you've got the Instagram photographer, I guess. I don't know.
You probably have a few things. You probably have some. I mean,
but it's a fairly lightweight model.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
A lot of good margins.
Lightweight,
sure.
High volume, I think.
But I don't know how scalable it is. So,
I don't know. I mean, I know with Vine there was that whole sort of. They'd set up. There was like a whole Vine studio type of approach.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's happened on Instagram.
I don't know. Yeah. We had a guy on the podcast here. He does Imagine, which has like the Quan and these like meme accounts and stuff.
Okay.
Right. But like in their original iteration, they actually like ran some kind of, like there was like a Vine condo building like in
that's the one
in Hollywood.
Yeah, there was a New Yorker article.
Yeah, he was like skulking around the gym, like trying to sign up Vine stars.
Okay.
I could have that wrong. Sorry, Barack, if I slandered you.
Yeah, well. Okay, so finally, last but by no means least, I should ask you a question about the public relations industry.
Okay.
Which we, of course, cover. Do you see much evidence of them being successful in their attempts to kind of infiltrate the digital world, I suppose?
I mean, I'm going to say this as someone, so my sort of disclaimer is I do not focus very closely at all on the public relations advertising agency industry. But that
Why
won't
not?
stop me.
You're
will not
really
stop me
missing
from
out.
commenting as if I do. So with that disclaimer out there, in covering agencies for many, many, many years, I know this. They all want to get into each other's businesses.
Yeah.
That's what they want to do. If you're an agency that is really good at advertising, you want to do digital. If you're a digital agency that's really good at like building websites, you're going to call them digital products, and then you're going to want to do TV commercials. If you're a public relations agency, you're going to want to do advertising. You're going to want to do digital. And I think, look, if you're a consulting agency now, you want to do advertising. It's like everyone's in everyone else's business. So some are gonna make the leap, and some are gonna sort of fall back to what they're good at, because there's a lot of there's PRing of this before you're really doing it. I'm sure. Like, I mean, I remember covering like these search agencies that were trying to become like quote unquote real digital agencies and stuff.
Yeah,
and they would like, it's sort of like fake it till you make it. They would claim they were doing all these kind of like, we're going to do this, and it's like, yeah, but most of what you do is like SEO. Let's be real.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's my general theory about agencies, is they always want to do what the other agencies are doing.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I guess they say
Nobody wants to stick in their lane.
No, I know. Yeah, no one wants to stick to
because
their
everyone's
knitting.
getting squeezed, So
They see they see it as like a promised land where there's easier and bigger budgets and
and then it's harder because that's not what they're known for and stuff like this. But I think it's pretty typical. I mean, a business, you got a set of clients. You either get more clients or you do more for your existing clients, and the only way you do more for existing clients is offering more services.
Yeah,
so
horizontal.
It's probably more efficient to try to offer more services.
Yeah, probably. All right. So, any other consumer goods companies you want to attack?
No,
Or- it's only Unilever.
Poor Unilever.
Thanks so much for
Yeah,
your time.
thank you for
This
coming.
has been fun, and let us know when you're. Perhaps I don't know if you come to Asia.
I'm broadly the region. I go to Japan. I because we have a joint venture. We have a site there, Digiday Japan.
Oh, okay, cool.
Digiday.jp.
All right.
So usually like once a year.
Okay.
but-
Well, we'll probably see you in Cannes, I guess.
Yes.
All right. Excellent. Thanks a lot, Brian.
All right. Thank you.
You've been listening to The Echo Chamber. Brought to you by The Holmes Report and produced by Marketeers. Sponsored by the Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.